Welcome, everyone, to another night of Bible study coming to you from Solid Rock Church of Mandarin. We are located at 12855 Old St. Augustine Road in Jacksonville, Florida. The pastor here is Bishop Vernon L. Walker, and tonight my name is Minister Anita McGee, and I will be bringing to you a Bible teaching. Tonight we'll be opening from the Old Testament, the short book of Ruth. It's located in the Old Testament, and we'll be speaking from Ruth, the first chapter. And some of you may know the story of Ruth, but we're not going to talk about Ruth tonight. We are going to talk about Naomi, her mother-in-law. And the title of this teaching is going to be called, And a Little Bit of Joy. A little bit of joy. And you'll see why we want to talk about joy. In the opening scenes of this book, it's a description of the grief and the hardship that Naomi experienced. And we're going to start at the first verse. It said, Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And this journey that he took was a temporary journey, because it said there was a famine in the land, and he left because of the famine. So this was a temporary journey to escape hardship. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came to the country of Moab. Now, people who lived in they were called Ephrathites because they were from Ephrath. And that is the old name for Bethlehem in the Old Testament. That's one of the old names for Bethlehem. The famine was one of the first of Naomi's road to bitterness, as we're going to find out. She went through hardship. Her husband decided to leave where they were living to go to another country. And probably when they went to the other country, it was maybe a different culture. It was slightly different from what she was accustomed to. So there was the famine, and then her husband decides to leave her homeland where she knew everything, had family, everybody was there probably, and he took her to another place. So this caused some type of distress, and I'm sure it did, some emotional distress in her life, because I can identify with that when I came here to Florida with no family and no friends at the time when I moved here. So I'm pretty sure that she was feeling some type of distress during this situation. So the famine was one of the first of Naomi's road to bitterness. Her husband decided to move the family from Bethlehem, Judah, their homeland, to go to Moab. And then as we read on in verse 3, and it says, And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. So that's number 2. That's another whammy. She goes to this country, away from her people, away from her culture, and she comes back alone. She's now alone because her husband has died. And you're going to see why I said that she's alone. Then it goes to verse 4. And they took them wives of the women of Moab, talking about her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They took them wives of the women of Moab. Now, they married Moabite women, but they were Israelite. And we know that normally in the Old Testament, the Israelites weren't supposed to mix in marriage and things like that. So Naomi's sons, this is number 3, and I'm pretty sure this distressed her. Naomi's sons, they married Moabite women and not Israelite women. And although the law of Moses did not explicitly forbid an Israelite from marrying a Moabite, it was well understood that Moabites and their descendants were excluded from the congregation of Israel for 10 generations because of idolatry. And you can read about that in Deuteronomy 23, 1 through 4. So I'm sure that she was pretty distressed that now her sons have taken another path and finding their wives something else that they weren't supposed to be doing. And this alone, knowing that these women were Moabites and not Israelites, should have dissuaded them from marrying the women, but it didn't. And it wasn't enough for them to say, okay, we're going to do the right thing because of our mother either. So I'm pretty sure she was upset with her sons for doing this. So this is another thing that Naomi had to be distressed about and upset about in her life. And it said, and they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. They dwelled there 10 years with these wives. And then we get down to verse 5. Here's another thing. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. Now her 2 sons are gone. She's moved from her country to another country. Her husband has died. They've married Moabite women who were serving idols, and now they both died. Now she's really left alone. That's what I meant when I said now she's alone. She is alone. In her mind, she's alone. So, and Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Everyone that she loved the most, I'm sure, they were gone. Okay? So all of these things together, that's enough to distress anyone. And in her life, Naomi, she suffered. She was suffering. I'll say she was suffering, okay, when everyone died and left her. But the name Naomi, which is her name, as the word says, means pleasant, lovely, delightful. That's what her name meant. But because of the negative and tragic events in her life, Naomi didn't want her name to any longer be Naomi. And as we read along, we can see why she was distressed in her life. But my subject is called And a Little Bit of Joy, and we'll see why I chose that subject for this particular passage. Even though she was going through a lot, Naomi failed to see that she was still blessed. She was still blessed in a lot of ways, because when they moved from one place to the other, she still had a roof over her head. It never stated in the passage that they ran into any trouble or anything with the people there. They dwelt there 10 years. She still had a roof over her head. She still had food to eat. She still had her sons for a time. She had her daughter-in-laws. She was still blessed, but she failed to see these things as she was going along. And so we're going to go down to verse 6. It says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people and given them bread. So she's still in Moab, but now she hears that the famine is over in her home country, so she decides that she's going to return. She's going to return to her home country. Okay? It says, wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. So they left. She took Orpah and Ruth with her. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. Even though they started out with her, she told them, she said, I want you to go. Go, because I guess at this particular time, she was feeling like she had some bad luck going on in her life, and she didn't want them to go along with her. She didn't want these things that were happening to her, the hardships, to be for them as well. So she told them to go on back home, go on back to your mothers, go where you came from. And in verse 10 it said, and they said unto her, surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Now she's really hard on herself. She's just looking at everything negatively. She's not even looking at the fact that her daughters-in-law, they're a support team. They want to be with her. She's not even seeing that right now. She said, turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown so you could marry them? So now she's really pouring it on thick. It sounds like a real pity party just about, right about now. She said, nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes, that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. Now that was something to say. She was going through so much, she still failed to see that as she was going through, that the Lord was still with her. Her daughter-in-laws were still with her. They were still loving her. It didn't ever say that they encountered any type of danger on their way back to her country. This is my point. Always find things to be thankful for no matter what you're going through. There are things that can bring you joy. There are things that you should stop and recognize. Stop focusing on the hardship. Stop focusing on the negative. Think on the positive. Look at the joy in your life. If you have a home with a roof over your head and you're not hearing bomb alerts, nobody is coming to drive you out of your home. You have food. It may not be everything you want to eat, but you're being fed. Your children are safe. You can go to sleep in peace. And then the Lord is gracious enough to wake you up the next day so that you can give him some glory and give him some joy instead of focusing on what you don't have or what you want and you don't have. Not even what you need and you don't have, but what you want and you don't have. Sometimes we have to focus on the things that are going to bring joy, the things that are joyful in our lives. So Naomi, all of these things happened to her. The famine, the husband dead, the sons are dead. Okay? They married Moabite women. So she's distressed. She's distressed. So in verse 14, her daughters-in-law who are still with her now she's to the point where she's saying the Lord is even against her because of all this other calamity. In verse 14, her daughters-in-law, they lifted up their voice and wept again. They cried. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. Now listen to this. And she said, behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. Now, I don't know if I had wanted to be by myself that much to where I would have told someone who wanted to be with me to go back. But this is what she did. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. And the Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught be but death part thee and me. Now, Naomi had someone in her life who loved her to the point where they were willing to give up everything else they may have wanted to be with her. That's how we should look at some of the things and the people in our lives. Those who are there to support us, those who care about us, even when we're going through things, they're still there for us. Appreciate them. But in her bitterness, Naomi couldn't really see that in her bitterness. So Naomi was being very opposite of what her name meant. Pleasant, lovely, delightful. Okay? So if we go down to verse 19, it says, so the two went until they came to Bethlehem. Ruth decided to stay with her, so they're on their way back to Bethlehem. And it came to pass, when they were come to Bethlehem, that all the city was moved about them. And they said, "Is this Naomi?" Okay, so she got back home safely. That's another thing to be happy about. Every day that you go out and you come back, that's another thing to give God the glory for. Another little bit of joy, something to focus on. Okay, so they said, "Is this Naomi?" They're happy to see her. And in verse 20 it says, "And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty have dealt very bitterly with me." She said very bitterly, even though she still had clothes. She had a roof over her head. She had someone in her life who was supporting her and loving her and just hanging in there with her. And the one who gave her breath, the breath of life, that's the one that she said, "He has dealt very bitterly with me." Her creator, her God, the one who loved her the most. And in verse 21, it says, this is what she said, "I went out full, and the Lord have brought me home again empty." She's thinking about everything she lost. Not what she still has, but what is gone. She said, "He brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me?" That is really something, isn't it? Are we like that? I hope not. Always find the joy no matter what the storm is, no matter what you're going through. God is still with you, because he said he would never leave you or forsake you. And he won't. He died for us. He died for us. Do you know many people who will die for you, who will forgive you of your sins no matter what? He will take you back when you walk away. He will still continue to love you and bless you and keep you. She said, "And the Almighty hath afflicted me." That's what she said. And Mara means bitter in taste or experience. That's what Mara meant. And we know that Naomi thought that God was against her, and that's why she became bitter, but God wasn't against her. She didn't know what God was doing. She didn't know, because she was too focused on herself and how she was feeling and what had happened to her. What happened, happened and can't be undone. But we can focus on the things that are joyful in our lives now. So just have a little bit of joy sometimes. Some people avoid bitter flavors and bitter foods and things like that. Who wants bitterness? No one wants bitterness. I know I don't. Okay, but sometimes on another angle, bitter things can be good for us. And Naomi was going through a bitter season in her life, but she doesn't know what God was doing through that bitter season in her life, what he was trying to accomplish. Okay, so sometimes we have there is something called a bitter melon, okay, and it's a cucumber-shaped melon. It's very bitter, but it's good for us. It's packed with phytochemicals and antioxidants, but it's bitter to the taste, but it's good for us health-wise. So I'm going somewhere with this. And it's just like cranberries. They are tart and they can be bitter, but they can also reduce inflammation, blood sugar, blood pressure, stomach infection, and tooth decay. So they have a purpose, even though they're bitter. And even though some things in our life come and they're bitter, they have a purpose. We all have the bitter moments, but God has a remarkable way of using them for our spiritual and our emotional well-being. So Psalm 30:5 says to us, "For his anger endureth but a moment, and his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." And that is so true. Joy does come in the morning. And I'm going to give you a definition of joy. Merriam-Webster says that joy is a feeling of great pleasure or happiness that comes from success, good fortune, or a sense of well-being. But Naomi couldn't see that. She couldn't see that she was still blessed, even though there were some things that went wrong in her life. She still had things to be thankful for and joyful about. She couldn't see it at the time. And Psalm 30 and 5 just assures us that our trials and afflictions, they are only temporary. They're just there for a season. They're only for a season. What begins must end. And that's just a fact. And this is exactly what happened in the end of Naomi's story when we get to Ruth, the 4th chapter. Now, when you get a chance, if you want to, read chapters 2 and 3. I didn't go through those, but things happened to get to the end of Naomi's joy coming in her life. So we're going to go to chapter 4 now, and when we go to chapter 4, we're going to see that the Lord was working behind the scenes. So that's what we have to remember. Even when we're going through this bitter season and things going wrong and it just seems like they just won't stop coming, you got to know that God has a purpose and a reason for everything. When we go to Ruth, the 4th chapter, verse 14, and it says, "And the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which have not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel." And that, they said that to her because in chapters 2 and 3, God was working behind the scenes through her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the one that she tried to send away from her, send back. But we don't know what God is doing. And that's how we do. In the first chapter, Naomi didn't seem to focus on anything joyful, nothing. There was no joy in her life. She was one of God's chosen people. That was something to be joyful about. She was aware of the great things that the Lord had already done for his people. That was something to be joyful about because she was an Israelite. But she allowed the sorrows of life to blind her to the things to be joyful about. Let's not do that. We are God's children. He loves us. He cares about us. Every detail, he cares about it. She did experience the joy of the status of being a wife. She was a mother. And those two things in themselves were very important in the Old Testament days. If you were a wife and a mother, that was status. That was status. And there's no indication that they were ever homeless either. And all that they went through, nothing says that they were ever homeless. She was blessed with one daughter-in-law who loved her enough to stick with her through thick and thin. She was protected, as I said before, in her travels, and still wasn't completely alone after her husband and her sons died, because the Lord was with her, and he was keeping her. So throughout the book, God worked in providential ways for her and her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And by the end of the story, by the time you read down through chapter 4, by the end of the story, Naomi was one of the happiest grandmothers in the Bible. She was a really happy grandmother. So my point to us today is, with a little bit of joy, don't let the bitter moments in life distract us from the joy of God's presence in our lives. What could be more joyful than that? God's presence in our lives. So don't let these seasons of bitterness come and steal the joy that we can have, because we can choose how we live. We can choose joy in spite of our circumstances, because the joy of the Lord is our strength, and we know that we have him. And Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose." So how do we choose joy? That's accomplished by relying on God's help and remembering what he's already done for us before, reading and believing his word, and that for everything he has a purpose. And Jeremiah 15:16 says, "Thy words were found, and I did eat them." Stay in the word of God. Just stay in his word. And it says, "And thy word was unto me the joy and rejoicing of mine heart. For I am called by thy name, O Lord God of hosts. We're his children. Read his word and find joy in it, and it will help you to be joyful as you go through your trials and tribulations. He told us we would have them. We shouldn't believe ever that God is against us. Don't ever believe that, especially when we're going through difficult circumstances and adversity. He plainly told us in John 16:33, he said, these things I've spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. And what is cheer? To shout for joy? That's what it means. Don't you do that when you go to a game? They have cheerleaders, and that's what they do. They cheer and they shout for joy, or it's praise. That's what it is. That's what cheering is. To be comforted, to be encouraged, that's cheer. And Philippians 4:4 says, rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. And what does rejoice mean? That's another form of joy. Rejoicing means to show great joy or delight. And that's what we should do, because our God is a way maker. He's a miracle worker. He's a promise keeper. He's a light in the darkness. Even when I don't see that he's working, even when I don't feel like he's working, and he never stops working. So that, my sisters and brothers, should give all of us a little bit of joy. God bless you. We love you. Take care.